So hello everyone, bonjour, welcome. So just inviting you all to settle in. And maybe just an opportunity to take a moment to actually recall what brought you here today for this next Compassion Grand Rounds. And so I want to really acknowledge this beautiful group that has gathered here in person, but also want to welcome the people that are joining us through the wonders of telehealth. So last time we checked, there was about 5 telehealth sites connected, and I imagine a few more may have joined us. So welcome, everyone. So before I go any further, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we gather here today on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And we want to recognize the treaties that have been made on these territories, and also to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. And we hope that these efforts that we're actually doing right here today, just by the very fact that we're gathering, have contributions to a more loving and compassionate world, and also to contribute to the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration that we're all called to in our community. So my name is Micheline Saint-Hilaire, and I'm now Director of Corporate Affairs and Communications here at the hospital. And so Danielle Lucier, who's the CEO of the Catholic Health Corporation, has asked me to welcome our keynote speaker today. And I know many of you, so I'm happy to see familiar faces and also welcome people that I haven't yet met. But I left my daily involvement with the Compassion Project, but it seems like it's a movement that keeps drawing me back in, and I have to say that it's still something that I hold near and dear to my heart, so I'm happy to be tasked with this honor of introducing Dr. Leah Weiss today. So I know that many hands and hearts contribute to making these gatherings possible, so I want to acknowledge all the people that work behind the scenes to make this event possible. And I know also that your visit, Leah, is a long time coming. And through the vision and commitment of the people of the Compassion Project and the Catholic Health Association of Manitoba, the Interfaith Healthcare Association of Manitoba, we are able to see this visit to the heart of the continent come to fruition. So I thank everyone deeply for believing that this was even possible. It's an honor to welcome a pioneer, an international leader in the movement of compassion cultivation, and also this great innovation in preventing a burnout by connecting us all to what's really meaningful and purposeful in our work lives and beyond. And so Leah Weiss is a researcher, trainer, consultant, author. It ends here, but I know she's a spouse, a mother, a friend, etc. She teaches courses on compassionate leadership at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and is a principal teacher and trainer for the Stanford Compassion Cultivation Program. She also directs compassion education and scholarship at Hope Lab, which is a research and development nonprofit focused on resilience. So Leah and I did cross paths in 2012 as we ventured into the Compassion Cultivation Training Program. And this is a course that is available to you all. And we might have people that have taken CCT with the Compassion Project. So Leah, you have touched our community from afar. And now you're here in person to inspire us in all that we do. So we're honored to have you here with us. And so without further ado, the floor is yours.
morning, good afternoon. I'm jet lagged. It's one of the two. It's great to be here with you all. And I've been hearing for years now about the compassion projects and initiatives underway here. And I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to visit in person. What I'd like to do is, with our time together today, share some of the research and trainings I've been focusing on in the context of compassionate leadership. So we all know in 21st century leadership, most of us are not sitting around with ample extra time on our hands, looking for something to do. We're moving, it's fast-paced. Also, we're in an interesting moment where we're trying to understand what our concept is of what it means to be a professional and also hold other roles in our lives. And I loved the update that was made to my bio because it speaks to this fact that we're in a moment where we are trying to bring together and make sense of professional and personal aspects of our identity and do that in new ways that create less work-life conflict. I don't know if you happen to have seen about 2 years ago, there was a BBC clip of an anchor doing an interview in his home office, and his toddler video bombs into the room, followed by the younger kind of in between baby and toddler in one of those coasters and scoots in, and he has this look of horror on his face, and then his wife comes and pulls the babies out. Following on this video clip that went viral, and I think really captured people's imagination because of the humor, but also the implicit question of how is it we hold the multiple roles, the being interviewed while being a parent in spaces where we're doing multiple activities. So there's a follow-on meme, which is probably worth Googling after if this is interesting to you. And these are screenshots from the follow-on meme, where a woman also in her home office being interviewed with BBC interview questions. Her toddler comes in, and you see that their toddler is kind of walking in through the door. She grabs the toddler, starts giving a bottle while she is answering the interview questions. Then she reaches under her desk where it turns out she's been cooking dinner at the same time somehow through this hybrid invention of a desk and oven. So out comes the turkey and she's checking on it. Then her significant other shows up at the door waving a sock around, really clearly freaked out about finding the socks match. So she solves that problem all while answering interview questions. And then it culminates with her literally diffusing a bomb. And that's what you see in the bottom frame, all while continuing to answer these questions. So of course there's layers to this, a gender critique, which was what I first really saw conspicuously. But as I started to think about this, because it really did capture so many of our imaginations, I realized this also actually has another message in it as well. The goal to have the capacity to have multiple roles at one time is a beautiful vision. But also, that's another set of pressure. Who can live up to? I have 3 young children. I don't know that I could live up to that level of composure in handling all of these different needs at one moment in time. So I want to frame that as part of what we're working with in the context of 21st century leadership. And I want to invite each of you to ask yourself the question, what is your mental model for how you want to hold all of this? Are you more comfortable with a kind of line in the sand and a professional self over here and a personal self over here? If you aspire to juggle or spin all these plates at one time, are you compassionate with yourself in the process of trying to do that? Because it's no small task. We're also in a moment where many of us, as you well know, have more than one person's position. And so our lists are long and our lists have lists. And we're in a moment because of all these pressures. You see, if you look at the data, increases in organizations across sectors where microaggressions are on the rise, bullying, and outright workplace violence, it all come together with our sense of scarcity of time, scarcity of resources. So the point I'm trying to create here is not to depress you all in your lunch hour, but actually to make the the statement that now more than ever we need to be thinking about when there's so many factors that make it challenging to be compassionate as an individual in an organization. More than ever we need to take seriously, if this is a real goal of ours, how are we going to be countercultural and make that happen? So that's what I want to spend the rest of the talk sharing ideas about. So interestingly, you see when you look at challenges reported by employees, this recent LinkedIn study showed up on my desk from a reporter on the NBC workplace beat saying, it's interesting, in this most recent survey, all the challenges that people are talking about are people challenges, plus email, and that's like the universal challenge these days. But it's things around how do we interact with each other, how do we deal with our managers and politics, coworkers, work-life conflict are all the top questions in our mind, speaking back to the ideas I just mentioned. And I think this is what leads us to where we are right now, when we're in a moment where soft skills, while they're not a new concept, they've been around and researched for a long time, for decades, but our focus on them is increasing now, given this context. And even in MBA programs, which historically, like Stanford's, have been about maximizing innovation and financial benefits, you see that increasingly the program is skewing towards creating foundational character and soft skills leadership. And Stanford's not the outlier in this. You see this at Harvard, Columbia, MIT, Yale, and some of the research I'm going to share with you today comes from the researchers in these organizations, in these academic centers, because we're actually in a moment where technology is changing so quickly. So if you're in the midst of getting a formal training in leadership and you are investing a lot financially in any of these programs, a lot, you're going to ask yourself, what's the best investment I can get with this time? And if you spend your time getting technical training, it's going to be obsolete by the time you're out in the workforce 2 years later. And you hear this echoed by leadership and by data. If you talk to CEOs of companies about what they got out of their MBA programs that actually mattered when they were in the workforce, it's the people skills. If you look at the data, people get their first jobs based on their technical skills, but their continued development is based on these soft skills. And it impacts the bottom line of organizations in many different ways. And this is part of what's interesting. If you look across sectors, a company like Aetna, which I'll pull out, I just finished a case study for the Stanford-Harvard database. Aetna is investing and has been investing since its prior CEO a lot in mindfulness. And we'll table for the moment the merger with CVS and all the implications of that, which of course will impact how these kinds of soft skills trainings will play out. But the fundamental commitment has been handled in a very interesting way. So in addition to having these courses that people would go through on mindfulness, eight-week courses, they were tracking data in a very specific way related to productivity. So if you went through one of these 8-week courses, you would have a baseline measurement of your productivity in an average week before the course, compared with after the course. And they would amortize the increase in productivity or the change in productivity, the delta, by the amount of money that you were earning. So what you end up is actual figures that come back to people who take a mindfulness training course, how much more productive they are. So this is an interesting way of doing it, and you could take any number of different metrics, right? Substitute in compassion training. You could, and many organizations do, look at things like how does putting in healthcare teams into these trainings impact patient satisfaction, impact retention, absenteeism, all these other metrics, just to put the kind of research bee in your bonnet if you are interested in these questions. And trying to, I'm imagining a number of you in this room are compassion ambassadors. And I really encourage people, or at least aligned with the concept of it. And I encourage people in your position to think about what's the internal business case. If this is something you know matters, then how does it align with the metrics you're already working on? And just as a way to start to think about it and tie together the investment of time and training. So the question of how we go about doing these leadership trainings, I've already spoken about a few different methods. Mindfulness 8-week courses, we've heard about compassion training 8-week courses. There's a number of different ways of approaching soft skills or emotional intelligence training. And they fit in with this bigger vision that I was talking about of 21st century leadership competencies, which if you ask, as an example, Stanford Business School, compassion is the first on the list of 21st century business skills, followed by courage, curiosity, and humility. This is actually surprising to many people, right? They would think the hub of innovation and profit maximization wouldn't necessarily be thinking about intellectual humility as a key leadership characteristic. So I want to put this out here for you to grapple with, actually, by design. What does that mean in the context you're working with? Are these values valued? How are you communicating and training them, if they are? And this is the framework that I've put together and that I teach at the MBA program with executive education at Stanford and in a number of organizations. And all four of these quadrants have robust sets of research around them and why they matter both to individual resilience and leadership and productivity, but also at the organizational level. And I don't have time to go through each of these in great detail, but I'm going to give you the high level and focus in on subset for the sake of helping you understand how I go about this work. And I also think one of the key things to keep in mind is where we're coming to the work from. Are we led by our individual values and what aspects of our history? And to that end, it's important to me to share a little bit about the framework and where it comes out of. So for me, I developed this out of my time at Stanford as an undergraduate. I was studying resilience and took a number of undergraduate research grants to go and spend time in northern India and Tibetan refugee communities to study what were the methods, the tactical ways that Tibetans in diaspora were working with resilience, and then coming back and studying what were the psychological research on resilience, and so on. And one of the things that became very clear is that these contemplative practices, the meditations, the introspection, at this time it was kind of the dip behind. In the 70s, there was a lot of popularity for these methods, and then they kind of went out of vogue, and now they're like way back in vogue, as you well know. And so at this moment for me, I became interested in trying to tap into what research was still happening and what were the opportunities. And by the end, actually Stanford, of my graduate work, it coincided with Stanford starting this compassion center that was inspired by the work of the Dalai Lama and his kind of call to secular ethics, which is the idea that no matter what religious background we come from, or if we are secular humanists and have no religious affiliation, for our own collective survival, we need to find ways to talk about and train in and research ethical capacities. So compassion is one of these key ones, so bringing together the researchers, what are the interventions, so that the methods that would be trained in wouldn't just be someone's like random idea, that it would have data behind it, and we would continue to improve on understanding what creates actually more compassion in diverse contexts. And then for me, this then led to the next step of doing this research and work at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where I've been teaching and also doing work with the Behavior Lab to understand how organizations can bring these soft skills in. So one of the aspects of the framework that I want to focus in on with you today is about purpose. And the reason I'm selecting this is I think it's kind of the least broadly marketed of these skills. And I thought it might be interesting for that perspective because it's related to and a foundation for compassion, clarity, and purpose. And I want to share with you some of the research and methods to amplify purpose. So a question for you in the crowd, and you can take this poll mentally. You don't have to do it externally raising a hand, but just for you to do an internal audit. How much of a typical workday for you feels purposeful? Is it more than 50% or less than 50% of an average day? Just to get your own baseline. So interestingly, in the States, over 50% of people, when they're responding to questions about purposefulness and basic kind of understanding of roles at work, 50% of people say they don't know what they're supposed to be doing at work, which leads us to these terrible engagement metrics, right? If you literally don't know what your job is and how it fits in with your organization's goal, it's hard to get really excited about it. So I think that's just a fundamental kind of obvious way where purpose and clarity and purpose matters, but we'll move on from there. Barb Fredrickson, who's a pioneer in positive psychology of the highest order, has also taken an interest in this topic of purpose. And I love her definition: a far-reaching and steady goal. You're not going to check it off your to-do list. It's something personally meaningful. So it can't be implanted from your best friend, your sister, or your organization. You must do translational work to make it relevant to you. And then here's the kicker. Well, maybe less so in healthcare, potentially. It's self-transcending. So the goal's got to be bigger than like paying my bills or meeting my needs to really function as a true sense of purpose and have all the health and organizational benefits I'm about to talk about. And I think if we're trying to wrap our minds around why purpose matters, one of the most clear, profound articulations we have of this is through the writing of Viktor Frankl in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, in the context of the Holocaust and concentration camps. And here's one quote to give a sense of his thinking, that those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. And his why, which he goes through in great detail, his why is love. His why is his commitment to make sure that love never dies in his heart, no matter what is happening externally, no matter how horrific it is. So that is a very strong and personal and big why. It fits the kind of criteria of purpose that I put up from Barb Fredrickson. So now to take you back to a little review of your probably psychology 101 or potentially history back in the day, a couple of terms that come out of classical Greek thinking. One is this concept of eudaimonia. It's a sense of living life in a full and deeply satisfying way. And it is contrasted as a route to happiness. So this purpose-driven approach to life as a key route to happiness is contrasted with hedonia, which is seeking after positive affect, pleasant experiences. These are two different, for thousands of years old, we've been debating which is truly creating more conditions for happiness. Interestingly, you may have also seen in current happiness research, these terms are coming back up to try to understand, does one of these approaches actually, like as an intervention or a quality, create more happiness? And it turns out that eudaimonia wins the day, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the research for why in the next few studies that I'll share. So one of them, one set of research, and you see this, I'm going to share a study out of Stanford's psychology department, but this has been validated and replicated and explored further in many different labs, including Tanya Singer, who is a prominent thinker and neuroscientist in this compassion space in her lab in Berlin. So what Brian, who's been involved in our Compassion Center at Stanford from the beginning, he studies neuroeconomics, which is a really interesting field, looking at how the brain lights up and interprets different optionality when we're making choices about what to bet on or invest in. So basically, looking at your brain, making decisions in the context of an fMRI machine so you can see what lights up. So he also moonlights as having a strong interest in compassion, which is fortunate for all of us. So when there were a group of monastics coming over from India who were adepts or long-time practitioners of compassion meditation, he and his grad student took the opportunity to invite them into the fMRI machine and say, hey, do you mind coming, hanging out in this machine and doing a little compassion meditation, and we'll see which regions light up? And they were good sports. They said, sure. Will you take us on a tour afterwards, though, please? and so we did this. They went in the machines, and then they took the Stanford campus tour, which is lovely. So you'll have to do it if you ever come visit. But what they found was fascinating. So for many of us, I think when we hear the term compassion, we're thinking of it as having a cost to us and an unpleasantness, perhaps, that we're going to experience for a greater purpose. But what they saw in these studies, which is consistent with other findings, keep in mind, that the regions of the brain that light up during compassion meditation are the reward regions, meaning we find it pleasurable when we're actively extending compassion. It's different than empathy, which if you're empathetic for suffering, it would light up your pain regions, and you would not find that pleasurable. So I put this out there for you in terms of coming back to this question I just raised about happiness and eudaimonia. If you want to think in terms of purpose and work, I want to share a very brief history, and it's a Eurocentric history by design because the largest model that is impacting many workplaces comes out of the Eurocentric history. So just a name that I see that in bias, and also a lot of the other work about the interventions, interestingly, are born in other parts of the world. So meditation and the kinds of mindfulness and compassion practices are mostly coming, even the secular ones that are adapted for people from any background, they originally are coming out of Buddhist and Asian countries. So in terms of this Western history, this very brief history, Greece through the Middle Ages, and sometimes now, the relationship between work and was framed as a curse. It was literally a block to enacting purpose. And with this framing, nobody's particularly interested in going to work. You would rather be pursuing your sublime pursuits of lying around naked, having some cupids to hang out with, and there's no grapes in this picture, but there could be. Fast forward to the Protestant Revolution, and what you see is a change in the overall willingness to engage with work as a possible forum for purposefulness. And this has to do with this idea, this reconstruction that work could be a calling, that it could be a way to express what is our gifts and our talents and in what is most meaningful and purposeful to us. So again, I think this becomes a really interesting moment to reflect. How do I think about work? Is it in the way of what really matters in my life, relationships and contributions, or is it an expression of what most matters, or maybe some combination? Some days it's purposeful, other days not so much. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Interestingly, in terms of purpose, you can amplify purpose through multiple layers of an organization. You can do it through culture-wide organizational change. You can also do it in a team and departmental level. And you can also do it within yourself in individual leadership training. And I think it's important to acknowledge these three layers, because if we only talked about personal leadership and building out purpose, that would be ignoring some really important context, right, of the team and the organizational culture, and then the culture outside of the organization that's impacting as well. One of the metaphors that I think is worth considering in terms of building a sense of clarity and purpose in day-to-day, I want to share with you a very brief background of how I came to using this metaphor. It's not a new metaphor, but what was new to me was the way that it was explained by one of my students a few years ago, who was a mid-year officer in the United States military, came from a military family. His father was a general of the Army Corps of Engineers. And the father had raised the two sons to grow up doing puzzles. So when they were little, like my kids are little, they do these like giant chunky puzzles. There's like 6 huge pieces and you put them together. They get more and more elaborate. And before these boys went to West Point, he had them do a 1,000-piece puzzle with no box top. Now, I guarantee 10 years from now, if I try to get my boys to do this, they will say, no, we are not doing it. But they had discipline in this family. And so, which my family could learn a lot from. And the boys did do it. And on the heels of completing this, had conversations with their father about you can never underestimate the significance of returning time and time again to clarity and vision and how individuals fit in with the bigger whole that you're trying to create. And it comes back to those outrageous statistics I shared with you before. 50% of people don't know what they're doing and why. So of course they're not engaged, right? So for each of us as a team, as a contributor, as leaders, even if we're not leaders in the organizational chart, we are all leaders in our lives. We're leaders with our families and our communities. Clarity of vision is worth investing in, because if you think even about the mechanics of doing a puzzle and putting together the pieces of over time, that you have to continually refer back and forth to it, right? And without that vision, you are lost in the minutia of what you're trying to accomplish, and it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to get through the difficult patches. I want to share another version of the purpose research with you, just to give you a sense of how this is being undertaken. So this is a picture of Barb Fredrickson, whose purpose definition we looked at a few minutes ago, next to Steve Cole, who I've had the great fortune to have mentorship from. He runs a lab at UCLA, but they were both trained at Stanford together. And they're both interested in these questions around resilience and what you can do to create more of it and how purpose fits in. So this is an example of one of their early studies, which they've since replicated, and to give you a sense for how it's approached. So let's enact mentally the steps of the process they went through. So they first took the group of people and divided them in half based on their propensity to either have a eudaimonic, meaning, purpose-driven approach to life, or hedonic, positive senses, positive affect, make it more practical. So the eudaimonic group, let's say we put you on this side of the room. You are the side that you came into healthcare because you're passionate about service. After work, you go and contribute to your community group. On your vacations, the way you spend your time is giving back. This is this half of the room. We put you over here to all sit together so we could compare you with this side. You're the hedonists. So you rolled in this morning on your motorcycles after your job, after all day today, which you're going to get through by visualizing the next wild and crazy trip, the bungee jumping and parasailing. You're going to hit the bar and then call it a day. So we've got two kind of profiles, right? And then the question was, if we do both self-report, ask them about their happiness levels, and then use Steve Cole's social genomics approaches of polling what he calls the opinion of the human genome, rather than asking people. Take a blood draw, look at the genetic profile, and see if there's a difference between the two groups. So I'm going to share you a summary of what they found. Both sides of the room were equal in terms of your happiness. And of course, because this is academic research, the question was framed as how not depressed are you, right? Because that's the double negative is always more precise. But when we looked at the blood draws that Steve did, we saw a profound difference. This group had lower inflammation, higher antivirals, the sequence of genes that is predictive of things like heart disease, cancer, are all in a really good shape. Compared to this side of the room, I'm sorry, hedonists, your inflammation's off the charts, your antiviral response is much lower, and that predictive sequence, he calls it the molecular soup of death. So there's some interesting takeaways here. One is that human experience, so your self-report is actually moving in a different direction from your physiology here. And not to miss the headline, which is that purpose is related to health, which for me was a major aha. I knew that about compassion. I knew that about mindfulness. I'd never heard that about purpose, which is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about that today. I'm sorry about the formatting here, but I wasn't going to go through bullet by bullet because the point of this slide is to demonstrate to you that there are a whole range of biological markers that are relating to purpose and physical health, like salivary cortisol and cholesterol, all these kinds of factors around sleep and inflammation, even risk of Alzheimer's disease and mortality related to purpose. And then there's another set of research looking at purpose and mental health. And I think this is more intuitive in a sense, right? If you're strongly purposeful, you're going to have greater life satisfaction, stronger social connection, less depression, but still worth noting. And then there's all these ways in which having a strong sense of purpose impacts organizational goals, like absenteeism, engagement, retention, individual performance, and so on. So there's a framework that I actually think is quite practical, which is why I want to take a minute on it with you so that you have something you can bring out of this session with you and continue to reflect on. Dr. Amy Wrzesniewski, who teaches at the Yale School of Management, she has a course required of all first-year MBA students on purpose, and she's been a purpose researcher for a long time. And out of her research, she's created this threefold framework about different ways that we perceive our jobs. They're basically mindsets about our work. The first is seeing job as income. And sort of the shorthand on seeing if that's your perspective is that if you win the lottery on the way home today, you're not coming to work tomorrow, right? It's a means to an end, and if that end is met by another route, then you wouldn't be coming to your work, which is distinct from this concept of a career where you frame your relationship with your work as what I do today parlays into what I'm able to do tomorrow. It's growth, it's connections, it's a stepping stone moving towards a goal, which is again different from this concept of a calling, which is that my work makes the world a better place by doing it. And I want to share an example of a study because I think a first reaction, which is a reasonable reaction when you see this framework, is to say, okay, cool, if you're like CEO and really successful, you're probably in a calling, but if you don't have a lot of control over your finances and your time and what all, you're probably in a job. So Dr. Wrzesniewski is no dummy, and this is some of what she took to heart as to make research questions about it by looking at people in different roles. I'll share with you a janitor study next. She's done this with zookeepers. Interestingly, like healthcare professionals, highly purposeful, highly educated, highly committed, also self-sacrificing and have some of the propensities towards burnout that shared with healthcare for the double-edged sword of purpose and how that can play out. In administrative work, you see examples of each of these different mindsets, but I want to share another interesting set of studies that she did on janitors, and specifically in hospitals. So what she saw when she interviewed in-depth qualitative interviews of hospital janitors was you saw examples of each of these three perspectives. Some people talked about earning money, and by the way, this isn't meant to denigrate that. There is great dignity, and you see this in the interviews. Pride in supporting oneself, one's family, often one's extended family, compared to another perspective, which was a career perspective. And when you interview these people, what they would talk about is often they would have an example of someone who had been in their role and moved on to be maybe a facilities manager. So they were thinking about, if I do a great job at what I'm doing now, there's growth potential for me, a career path. And then you heard also examples of people who described themselves as being an instrumental part of the care team. Because if they don't do their job well, people will die of infection, and it's 100% accurate. One job, one set of tasks, three very different frameworks with which this set of tasks is approached. And I think there's a lot of ways that this is important and meaningful for each of us as individuals to think about. What is your framework when you think about your work? And I think it's also important not to be overly simplistic. If I look at any given week for myself, and I'm sure the case for you, there's some things that feel like a job. Maybe there's some things you do out of a calling perspective, and maybe there's, if you're lucky, some subset that's purposeful. I think one of the things we can pay attention to is self-awareness about our perspective and how much time we're spending in each of these, and that's one of the interventions actually to amplify purpose, is get more clarity on where purposefulness is already happening, and then strategically, incrementally developing that, especially through the use of, the academic term for it is extra role behaviors. But the kind of plain speak way of describing it is stuff you do while you're at work that's not a part of your core job description. So for example, if we're looking at the janitor studies, people who experience their role from a calling perspective were more likely to form strong relationships with patients. So strong that some of them reported about keeping in touch after the patients left. Or in one case, the patient passed away and coming to the funeral, they had developed such a strong relationship. Now, this is all born out of extra role behavior. The janitor's job was not to be in the middle of the night holding the hand, giving emotional support, but because they saw themselves as part of the care team, that was a natural extension of what their behavior looked like. And this seems to be a key for amplifying purpose, to find what already is purposeful in our work and develop it. And understanding that we can't all, if we're in role A, just throw out all the obligations we have in role A and move it to what we want. Of course, we have to be realistic. But if you look at small incremental changes, if you spend 1 or 2 hours a week on a project that lights you up, the difference that makes to the rest of your week. And then also flipping this for those of you who are managers. And those of you who are parents, you might want to be thinking about this at home. How are you encouraging people around you to understand what's meaningful, to find efficient ways to do more of that, and ask for what they love? And in terms of a management skill set, taking the small bits of time to ask people, not just like, where are you, status update on the tasks, but occasionally to understand what is meaningful to the people around us, because sometimes you find very kind of obvious retoolings that can happen, that person A has travel in their role and has young children or an aging parent and doesn't want to travel. Person B is an empty nester and would love to travel. They never talk to each other. If they did, you could reconfigure some of the work, right? And you actually see these are the kinds of outcomes that happen if you build in some of this discourse. And then another thing to just keep in mind is a lot of psychological friction happens when we are in one perspective talking with someone in a different point of view, and we're presuming they're looking at the job the same way we are. So maybe you are highly purposeful and you're working closely with someone who is viewing their work as a job. And you're constantly frustrated. You feel like they should be doing extra role behaviors, but they're not. And that's such your fundamental way of approaching your work. There's this disconnect. So just understanding where someone is coming from, finding ways to couch incentives, and just communication to meet them where they are. If someone's in a career perspective, then you could frame the work that you're offering them as developmental growth opportunities towards their ends. But if you don't know what their ends are, then you're going to lose out on that opportunity, meaning the engagement will go down, and the overall the kind of retention capacity goes down for an organization. And just to put a fine point on this fact that beliefs matter. Dr. Ollie Crum is another researcher at Stanford, and when she was doing her training at Harvard, she became deeply interested in a question of, what if we stop looking at placebo as a problem and consider that since it's so powerful, we might leverage it as an opportunity? What would that look like? So here's an example of one of her studies that got a lot of media attention, and you'll see why. So she takes the same milkshake, and it is identical in what it contains, but tells one group, this side of the room, the former eudaimonic group, you get told that it's Sensa Shake. There's 140 calories in it, and it is a healthy choice for when you don't have time to have a meal. the former hedonists, you get told that this is indulgence. There's over 600 calories. It's your treat for the end of a hard day. Guess what? Your hunger hormones respond according to the message you have heard about your milkshake. So you can see why the press went nuts on this. What you believe about your milkshake impacts how your body processes it. And she did a whole other set of studies around looking at people who were housekeepers in hotels. If you tell some subset of them, guess what? You are exceeding the American Surgeon General's recommendation for daily movement. And don't tell the other group that. You see these health benefits start to soar on the group that is going through their day thinking, this is great. Of course, I wish I was getting paid more and all the other things, but at least I'm physically active, which is rare these days, right? So I think there's understanding that our beliefs so fundamentally matter about what we eat, about what we do, and then more recently, Dr. Crum's research is specifically in healthcare interactions and how beliefs about the treatment, beliefs about the healthcare team impact the outcomes. And since that is unequivocally the case, how do we define better interactions around things like when you're giving a patient information about possible side effects, that you don't then capture their imagination and make it more likely they'll have it? I know this sounds like woo, but this is literally Stanford Psychology School of Medicine research that is happening right now. So coming back to kind of practicality, 2 ways to amplify purpose. If you look at the research and sort of aggregate it, because I like to come back to what's practical. So one approach basically is a whole set of resources around get more clear in your rational understanding about what your purpose is, right? And that could include things like a personal mission statement. And so I've developed kind of a user-friendly version out of the academic versions, which are a little bit clunkier. If that's interesting for you to do. But what it involves is basically just being able to say what matters to me with greater clarity in a way that is personally meaningful, right? And then there's this other approach that's acknowledging that we're not purely rational creatures. This is what Dr. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for, that we are actually counter to former thinking in economics. We are not rational actors exclusively. We have counter forces that are emotional, and if we don't account for those, then our behavior change and our behavior itself can't be understood without recognizing that. So these other interventions basically give you the sense that you don't need to, if you're not a person that can define your sense of purpose in a sentence, all is not lost for you. There's another whole route where you go through pattern recognition, looking at your days, looking over the context of weeks, trying to dial up a sense of purposefulness. And there's another tool that I've developed that does just this. It's a way for you to audit and iterate on your current roles and situations to move incrementally towards more purpose. So the question that I would ask for you, and this is not just a philosophical question, but really the behavior change need at this point. Given all this information, we need to hone down to one specific thing we can do. Because otherwise life is busy, and this will be something that's kind of kicking around in the back of your mind. But better yet, what is one purposeful thing you could do? What's one extra role behavior you could take up today, right? Maybe that's related, some of the examples Dr. Wisniewski talks about aren't just about with other people. Some people find a lot of meaning in beauty and creating more beauty in the physical environment of work. There's many different paths to this. So finding one purposeful step you can take and then start taking it repeatedly. Maybe it's bringing in plants or rekindling a desire to be the person to help spearhead recognition and celebration of life milestones in your group. Finding the thing that brings you a little bit of uplift and joy that you can do. And then, more briefly, I think extremely briefly, what I'd like to do is just share one of the ideas around compassion for you to move forward with, which is this notion of dual drives. So if you look back at evolutionary psychology, many of us got the lesson that from Darwin and evolution that competition and aggression and survival of the fittest is the whole story. And so this whole kind of path around compassion is nice, but maybe not so realistic. And so I think it's really important to return to the fundamental messaging that we are taking as assumptions, but also sharing when we talk about what's possible in organizations. So there's a whole other genre of thinking within evolutionary psychology that comes back to words of Charles Darwin himself. Sympathy will have been increased through natural selection. For those communities which included the greatest number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring. That is a counter vision to survival of the fittest, aggression, kill or be killed kind of ethos. And with this in mind, it's not to say we are all exclusively good, although if you want to build out a greater understanding of that perspective from evolutionary psychology, a great resource is Dr. Keltner's book, Born to be Good, which traces out the current research on this pro-social take on human evolution. But the way that I like to frame this in the context of life and organizations is we need to think in terms of dual drives, that we have competition and aggression in us, and we have pro-social, altruistic, compassionate behavior in us. And back to the 3 levels of individual, team, culture, our context pulls behavior out of us in ways that are profound and that we underestimate. And that's one of the key messages of social psychology is we, as people, continually underestimate the role of our environment in determining our own behavior. So what can we do to create an environment that primes us again and again to remember common humanity? The people around us are just like us. And I'll often get the questions at the organizational level, what can be done to create more connection to this concept? I think there's a number of ways in terms of leadership and culture and organizational design, but there's also some very practical things that we can do, like building out an explicit connection between what we're doing day to day with our sense of purpose and with the value of what we're trying to bring to the end user. So if it's the patient. And interestingly, you see this, there's a biotech company in the Bay Area, one of the largest ones in the world, and they've just done a massive internal campaign around, for their employees, making more explicit pictures on the wall and all of the internal messaging, the end user of the products that they're creating. Most of the people working in this biotech company will never meet those end users because they're working at the mothership and they're not clinicians. But that doesn't mean that the profound impact of their having these end users in mind, they can benefit from that. So it's something I want to encourage you to keep in mind, because it is these small steps that add up to the big changes for us in our lives. And when we make them together, there's massive impact that's possible. And if you want to read more context about some of the studies and lists and bullets, the book that I've written, How We Work, is a way of getting a fuller kind of articulation of some of the themes I've been discussing. But we have a few minutes left. If there's a couple of questions that anybody wants to bring up, I'd be delighted to engage, or reflections on how any of this content is resonating or not resonating with you in your life and role. And we've got a mic over here. Another possibility is if you had any ideas about what's one purposeful step you could take, if you want to share it out with the group, you might inspire someone else to take one as well. No takers? Oh, good, thank you.
So it's a comment. Bram Ramjawan, Director of Clinical Research here. I totally enjoyed your presentation. As a washed-up scientist, we all tend to think that it's all about p-values and confidence interval and positive predictive value, etc. And yet this is so important and intricate to how we do what we do. So it's more of a comment, but I wonder if I can recruit a comment from you about that.
This other side beyond the p-values and the importance of, it's interesting. I was just reading an article on the plane on the way here, one of the most recent collaborations between Dr. Crum and Dr. Verghese, who's well known for his best-selling books, Cutting for Stone, but also he's on the School of Medicine faculty and does a lot around presence in healthcare. And it was so interesting to see how they were framing in this piece that particularly how clinical trials relate to placebo effect, that basically you have to remove placebo effect to just be able to understand how a drug, for example, or a treatment impacts patients. But their point was, let's not do that willy-nilly. Of course we need to do it if our goal is to test a drug or understand a particular intervention. But we also could leave alongside this questions to understand how mindset and placebo effect can be best used. And so I think, to me, this has a lot of wisdom in it, that it's not an either or of, the great expertise you have that you're applying day to day is so important for healthcare. And what assumptions could be questioned and what scaffolding for additional questions to layer into your existing approaches might be possible, so that you're getting to hold both in your research and understanding. So to me, that was actually really logical, affirming, but also inspiring. So I'll share that back, their thinking. Thanks.
So I'm in spiritual care here. And a word that I was really surprised not to hear even once from your presentation was the word gratitude. And the reason I'm surprised is because it's a big focus of what I do with patients, especially those in despair, whose situations are truly horrible and there isn't any immediate fix for them, whether on a social or a medical level or a spiritual level, in fact. And a lot of what I try to do, and maybe it fits in with a piece of where you were talking about steps that reorient our expression, our experience, is to get them to identify, even in the midst of how terrible things are, and they are, we never minimize that, but to be able to identify something in this awful moment, even still, I can be thankful for. It changes the person over time. And there's a lot of studies now about the effects of gratitude specifically on altruism, on our emotional well-being, and I'm just asking for a comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. Gratitude is one of the well-studied positive psychology traits. I wasn't giving a talk that was saying, here's an overview of all positive psychology and how you can leverage it. I mean, I think for me, the challenge is when I'm in clinical settings with gratitude, it's definitely beneficial. It definitely relates to compassion and purpose. I also find it challenging, though, because from a pastoral sense, to push someone who doesn't feel open to gratitude in that moment can actually really, as you, I'm sure, well know, can alienate them further from the support they're receiving. So to me, it's a slightly different question to say, where can you find purpose versus where can you be grateful? And this is something that, is a much longer conversation that has both positive psychology as well as almost theological implications in it. But yes, of course, and if you look at any of these frameworks around positive psychology, gratitude, awe, I also didn't talk about that. There's a number of different subsets that would be valuable for patient care, your own personal satisfaction. A gratitude journal is a low-lift, great way to improve life satisfaction. I also think that for some people, having choices is really useful. So my goal is if purpose has gotten less attention, then great to put the word out there about how you can use it. So if you get that patient who's yeah, don't tell me to be grateful, I'm dying, thank you, that maybe you could frame it as purposefulness, and maybe that might be an alternative that would resonate with them.
Yeah, and sorry for the self-defensiveness, but I truly, it's not a trite thing or forced. It's just an invitation, because it's really powerful when you have your terrible circumstances acknowledged and affirmed and all the bad, difficult feelings that go with that. But when you can, in that moment, actually identify something you can be grateful for, however tiny, it is powerful. So I just
Undoubtedly.
want to say, I don't press it, but I think it's important to try a little bit and see, because I've seen it move people really profoundly.
Yes, and I think purpose is a great alternative if it's not working for a person to be grateful in that moment. Thank you. All right. It's the hour on the dot.
On the dot. So I just want to thank you, Leah, for this opportunity to explore whether it be how we incorporate gratitude, how we incorporate this idea that connecting to meaning and purpose in our work lives can lead us actually to being fully present. I heard the word presence, and I think that's something that in the context in which we do this work of health and human service, there is definitely a quest to being there for our colleagues, for each other, for the people that we serve. And I see that every day in the people that I work with here at St. B. So thank you for the work that you offer this world. You don't just do this here. It's Leah travels the world now to invite people into these reflections. So I want to say thank you to everyone here for saying yes to being here. It's not possible for us to have these Compassion Grand Rounds without this auditorium being almost completely full. It's really inspiring to see. And before we go, I also want to just, on behalf of St. Boniface Hospital, we're a community of service of the Catholic Health Corporation of Manitoba. I do want to thank the Compassion Project for its leadership over the years. I was part of it, and now it's called to new adventures, but really Don McDonald and Shauna Namaka were instrumental in making this visit possible, and many other hands and hearts, which I won't name, but you know who you are. And before you go, we have a signed copy of Dr. Weiss's book, and I propose that we give it to the person here in the Sam Cohen Auditorium whose birthday is either today or next. So whose birthday? Anyone having a birthday soon? So tomorrow, whose birthday's tomorrow? Today? Nobody here today? We have a birthday tomorrow? So, Dr. Bram Ramjuan, a signed copy of Leah Weiss's book. So thanks everyone for being here, and until soon.
That's perfect. I want to hear from him, though, if he reads it.